On April 8, 1943, high above Caen, France at an altitude of 27,000 feet, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichin allowed a faint grin to slip across his face beneath the tight fit of his oxygen mask. Through the pristine glass canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, he observed the cumbersome outlines of enemy aircraft forcing their way skyward, every movement heavy and deliberate. Hermichin, a seasoned ace of Jagdgeschwader 26, took in the scene with the detached amusement of experience. "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles," he remarked over the radio to his wingman, his voice colored with mockery as he watched the bulky Republic P-47 Thunderbolts make their awkward climb. Below his position, 16 P-47C fighters from the 4th Fighter Group held a disciplined formation. Their Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines, each pushing 2,000 horsepower, working furiously against the burden of their 7-ton frames. To the Germans' eye, they appeared more burdened than threatening, climbing with determination rather than grace. To the eyes of German airmen who were used to the elegant lines of the Spitfire or the quick darting movements of Soviet fighters, the American P-47s looked almost laughable, their thick barrel-like fuselages crowned with greenhouse-style canopies, undersized wings struggling to carry such bulk, and propellers larger than anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal gave them the appearance of lumbering giants rather than predators. Oberleutnant Hermichin had no way of knowing, nor did any of the German pilots circling above like hunters, that what they were really seeing was the opening act of a weapon destined to cripple the Luftwaffe's fighter force. In just a year and a half, these so-called flying milk bottles would cast off their reputation for clumsiness and become a nightmare over occupied Europe. With 850 caliber Browning machine guns embedded in their wings, they carried a promise of destruction that would soon make their approach one of the most dreaded sounds German pilots could hear. The power for this reckoning was already there, concealed in those wide, weighty wings. With 3,400 rounds of ammunition on board and a combined rate of fire reaching 6,000 rounds per minute, the Thunderbolt could unleash enough concentrated firepower to rip a Messerschmitt apart in under 2 seconds. That turning point began on the morning of April 8th, when Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, caught sight of the German formation, maneuvering into position for an attack. A veteran of the famed Eagle squadrons and only recently transferred from flying RAF Spitfires, Blakesley grasped a truth his younger pilots had yet to learn. Survival in the P-47 demanded a complete rethinking of aerial combat. The Thunderbolt was not a refinement of existing fighter doctrine, but a bold break from it, a machine designed with a philosophy utterly unlike anything that had come before. Where the Germans had invested in light interceptors built for quick climbs and sharp turns, Republic aviation had taken a completely different path, producing a machine unlike anything seen before, a high-altitude powerhouse that relied on brute strength, overwhelming engine power, and devastating armament to change the very nature of air combat. That April morning, 56 American pilots flew over the skies of France, and within their ranks were men destined for immortality, future aces whose names would one day carry a weight that chilled the hearts of Luftwaffe veterans. But on April 8, 1943, those American pilots were green, flying an unproven aircraft into the path of the most seasoned fighter corps on the planet. The Luftwaffe's veterans had honed their skills since 1939, across campaigns in Poland, France, Britain, and the vast skies of Russia. By contrast, the Americans had not yet seen a single day of combat. What followed became a lesson in how industrial power could overcome tactical mastery, how sheer numbers married to robust design could produce overwhelming dominance, and how mocking laughter gave way to fear once German pilots experienced the shattering effect of synchronized Browning machine guns tearing into an aircraft from 400 yards away. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt itself had its origins in the desperate atmosphere of June 1940, when German fighters rampaged over France. It was then that Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent orders from the U.S. Army Air Corps, build a high-altitude interceptor capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe's finest. What Kartveli ultimately created was something far beyond the original request, a behemoth that pushed the limits of fighter design. "It will be a dinosaur," he told his engineers with a wry smile, "but a dinosaur with good proportions." When the XP-47B prototype took to the air for the first time on May 6, 1941, it stunned everyone who witnessed it. At 9,900 pounds empty, it outweighed its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer, by a staggering 65%. The enormous turbo supercharger system, with its maze of ductwork winding through the rear fuselage, gave the plane a swollen, almost ungainly profile that led more than one test pilot to eye it skeptically and ask the same question: can this thing even fly? Yet, not only did it fly, it proved unmatched in performance once it reached the thin air of high altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a rugged 18-cylinder radial engine generating 2,000 horsepower, gave the Thunderbolt a unique edge. It could hold full power at 27,000 feet, an altitude where German fighters began to suffocate for lack of oxygen. Thanks to its turbo supercharger, driven by exhaust gases, the P-47 delivered sea-level performance even in the thin reaches of the stratosphere, far beyond the capacity of standard superchargers. Yet, despite its promise, the aircraft was far from beloved at first. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, in charge of the 56th Fighter Group training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, quickly developed a distaste for it. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training mishaps alone. In those early months, the Thunderbolt claimed more American lives in accidents than German guns would in combat. It had a vicious tendency to ground loop while landing, torque rolled violently on takeoff, and dove so aggressively that pilots encountered compressibility for the first time, their controls locking solid as shock waves rippled across the wings. Yet, for those who managed to tame its quirks, the Thunderbolt revealed an entirely different nature. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, an Oklahoma farm boy destined to become one of America's leading aces with 27 confirmed kills, recalled the sensation of his first flight vividly. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't so much fly it as point it." Still, the Thunderbolt's early combat record in April and May of 1943 seemed only to validate German assumptions. The P-47s proved unable to outturn the Focke-Wulf 190, couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109, and fell short in agility at mid-level altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly recognized and exploited these shortcomings, diving in from below to strike the heavy Thunderbolts where they were least effective, or luring them into tight-turning battles where maneuverability, not raw firepower, dictated survival. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, the commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, summed up his first impressions in a blunt report to headquarters. "The new American fighter is nothing but meat for the slaughter. It handles like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys call them Indians, big, clumsy targets pretending to be warriors." At first, the numbers appeared to support his scorn. In their opening month of combat, U.S. fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts while managing to shoot down only 3 German aircraft. Even the RAF, watching from their nimble Spitfires, cast doubt on America's choice. British pilots half-joked that the only real escape maneuver available in a P-47 was for the pilot to unstrap and sprint laps around the unusually spacious cockpit. Yet beneath the surface of those disappointing statistics, something was quietly taking shape, something the Luftwaffe's intelligence officers overlooked entirely. The P-47s that were lost in those first encounters had not gone down easily. On May 4th, one Thunderbolt limped home, bearing 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun impacts, damage that would have torn a Messerschmitt or Spitfire to pieces in midair. Its massive radial engine, with no delicate coolant systems to rupture, absorbed punishment that would have instantly silenced any liquid-cooled rival. Just as important, when the P-47s managed to bring their guns to bear, the effect was devastating. 8 heavy Browning machine guns created a dense convergence zone of fire, unlike anything German pilots had faced before. Early war fighters armed with rifle-caliber rounds or cannons with limited ammunition could never sustain such fury, but the Thunderbolt could keep up a continuous barrage for more than 30 seconds, a lifetime in the split-second world of aerial combat. The moment that began to shift German attitudes came on June 26, 1943, in the skies above Le Mans, France. It centered on Second Lieutenant Robert S. Anson of the 61st Fighter Squadron and quickly grew into one of the most famous duels of the air war. Johnson's unit of 48 P-47s was heading home after an escort mission when they were ambushed by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Su 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the renowned Adolf Galland. The Germans struck with textbook precision, diving out of the sun at tremendous speed, their advantage absolute. At the tail of the formation, Johnson's Thunderbolt bore the brunt of the onslaught. In the opening seconds, his aircraft was ripped apart. 20mm cannon shells slammed into it, shattering the canopy, spraying hydraulic fluid across the cockpit, tearing away the engine cowling and igniting flames behind the instrument panel. Johnson, bleeding from wounds to his nose and leg caused by shrapnel and bullet fragments, attempted to bail out, only to find his canopy hopelessly stuck. A 20mm round had detonated inside the track, sealing it shut and leaving him imprisoned in a crippled fighter nearly 5 miles above the earth. At 27,000 feet, with flames flickering near his instruments, oil coating the windscreen, an engine coughing on the edge of failure, and controls that responded only in fits and starts, Johnson somehow steadied the Thunderbolt and aimed it toward England. What followed defied every established belief about how much damage a fighter could endure. The P-47 held together when any other aircraft would have disintegrated into wreckage, but the ordeal was far from over. As the battered Thunderbolt limped along at less than 170 miles per hour, a lone Focke-Wulf 190 from the WW2 JG-26 closed in. Its pilot, whose identity has never been confirmed, though historians have suggested several possible names from German reports that day, spotting what should have been an easy kill. What followed ranks among the most remarkable duels in the history of aerial combat. Sliding into perfect position behind Johnson's crippled P-47, the German pilot unleashed the full fury of his 4 20mm cannons and twin 13mm machine guns. Johnson, powerless to maneuver, pressed himself against the armor plate behind his seat and prayed as the shells hammered into his already shattered Thunderbolt. Incredibly, the aircraft endured the entire cannon load without breaking apart. With his heavy ammunition spent, the German circled and attacked again, this time with only his machine guns, riddling the fighter even further. Finally, he eased alongside, flying wingtip to wingtip with the ruined American plane. Johnson, through a haze of oil and smoke, could see him clearly. A young blonde pilot whose confident expression faltered into disbelief, shifting from certainty to confusion and, at last, to something resembling fear as he stared at a machine that refused to die. The German swung back once more and poured the last of his machine gun ammunition into Johnson's Thunderbolt. Yet, impossibly, the battered fighter still refused to fall. Drawing alongside, the Luftwaffe pilot simply shook his head in astonishment, offered Johnson a casual salute, and then banked away, most likely out of ammunition and unwilling to waste further effort. Somehow, Johnson coaxed his mangled P-47 down to Manston, where the engine gave out as the wheels touched the runway. When ground crews inspected the aircraft, the damage defied belief. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One 20mm shell had detonated only inches from Johnson's skull. Another struck squarely against the armor plate protecting his back. The engine bore the scars of multiple direct hits. The control cables were frayed and partially severed, and 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural spine of the fuselage, had been shot clean through. And yet, against all odds, the Thunderbolt delivered Johnson safely back to base. The fact that such a shattered machine had managed to return shook both sides of the conflict. For the Americans, engineers poring over the wreckage came to a startling conclusion. They had underestimated the resilience of their own design. For the Germans, reports filtering in from Jagdgeschwader Ausni 6 were met at first with disbelief. No fighter, they insisted, could endure that level of punishment. But the testimony of multiple Luftwaffe pilots left little room for doubt. The P-47 had withstood the fiercest assault their best aircraft could unleash and still lived to fly again. By July 1943, U.S. pilots were beginning to unlock the Thunderbolt's hidden potential. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, had uncovered the key lesson through bitter experience. Never try to turn with the enemy. Don't try to climb with them down low. Don't try to turn with them. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. What had once seemed like crippling disadvantages now revealed themselves as the P-47's greatest assets. Its massive bulk turned into a weapon in its own right. In a dive, nothing in the Luftwaffe arsenal could touch it. From 30,000 feet, a Thunderbolt could plunge at speeds up to 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter, even in a vertical descent. That momentum could then be converted into altitude in a soaring zoom climb, leaving enemy pursuers floundering far behind. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would go on to become one of the first American aces in Europe, perfected the method that pilots soon called boom and zoom. Among the squadrons, though, it gained a more colorful nickname, the Thunderbolt Turkey Shoot. Rather than tangling in traditional turning battles, P-47 formations would climb high above the fight, reaching altitudes beyond the Luftwaffe's comfort zone, and then dive like hawks upon their prey. When enemy fighters showed themselves below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive, accelerating to such blistering speeds that German defenders found deflection shooting all but impossible. At the bottom of those dives, 8 heavy Brownings would roar together, unleashing a storm of firepower so dense that Luftwaffe pilots later likened it to slamming into a wall of lead. Planes caught in that deadly convergence didn't simply go down, they came apart in midair. The full measure of American firepower revealed itself on August 17, 1943, during the twin raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the boldest and deepest strikes into German territory attempted up to that point. That mission would expose the Thunderbolt's greatest weakness, its limited range, even when fitted with drop tanks, while also proving just how devastatingly effective it could be when its strengths were used to their fullest. Major David Schilling, commanding the 62nd Fighter Squadron, led his unit into one of the defining moments of that day. Spotting a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyers moving into position to strike the B-17s with their cannons and rockets, Schilling saw the danger immediately. These twin-engine German aircraft, purpose-built to tear apart bombers, were powerful but sluggish compared to single-seat fighters. Schilling and 3 other Thunderbolt pilots rolled into a steep dive from 28,000 feet, descending with crushing speed. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner aboard one of the Me-110s who lived to tell the tale, later described it in a POW interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters and saw good hits, rounds striking the wing. The P-47 didn't even flinch. Then he fired, and the plane ahead of us simply exploded into pieces. Not merely shot down, but annihilated. In a matter of seconds, one Messerschmitt 110 was ripped apart, its wings torn clean from the fuselage, the tail sheared away, and the crew compartment reduced to twisted shards of metal. In under a minute, 8 of the twin-engine destroyers were wiped from the sky. For the German pilots, it was unlike anything they had ever faced, an overwhelming storm of gunfire that shredded aircraft before they had a chance to react. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, for a total of 3,400, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At a standard convergence distance of 300 yards, all 8 guns' trajectories crossed into a killing zone just 6 feet across. Anything caught inside it was met with over 100 half-inch projectiles every second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Even the ammunition itself spoke to the staggering weight of American industrial power, a scale of production the Luftwaffe could scarcely imagine matching. While German fighters were often restricted to just 120 to 200 rounds for each of their 20mm cannons, barely enough for a handful of short bursts, American pilots and their Thunderbolts could keep firing for more than 30 seconds straight. Their standard ammunition belts were carefully arranged, combining armor-piercing incendiary tracers, and ball rounds in deliberate patterns meant not only to tear through metal, but to ignite whatever they struck. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would go on to become the leading American ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories, summed it up bluntly. When you hit them with all 8, They don't just go down, they explode. I once saw a 109 split clean in two, the tail breaking off one way and the nose and wings tumbling the other. The pilot never had a chance to realize what happened. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was confronted with a grim new truth about the P-47. Its capabilities grew stronger with altitude, precisely where German aircraft began to falter. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine allowed the Thunderbolt to hold full rated power all the way to 30,000 feet, while Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, dependent on single or at best two-stage mechanical superchargers, lost significant effectiveness above 25,000 feet. On October 8, 1943, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most celebrated aces with 206 victories, experienced this reality in the most fatal way. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a formation of B-17s flying at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin, high-altitude air, unable to match the Thunderbolts waiting above. The WW801 engine, so formidable at medium altitudes, struggled desperately for air nearly 6 miles above the Earth. At that height, the Focke-Wulfs became easy prey when the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group pounced from 32,000 feet. Among them was Robert Johnson, now a seasoned veteran closing in on ace status, flying at 31,000 feet when he caught sight of Hans Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf, marked by its elaborate nose art. In his report, Johnson described the engagement with cold precision, opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection, observed strikes along the entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. The loss of Philipp, a national hero with more than 500 combat sorties on both the eastern and western fronts, sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If a pilot of his caliber could not withstand the Thunderbolt, what chance did ordinary flyers have? The German High Command immediately called for a full investigation into the P-47's true capabilities. The assessment presented to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943 was grim. It confirmed that the Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, altitudes unreachable by any German fighter then in service. In a dive, it could push speeds edging toward the sound barrier. Its protection was formidable. A 3/8-inch steel plate shielded the pilot from behind. A half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen guarded the front, and armored deflection plates ringed the powerful radial engine. Most troubling of all, its robust design meant a single P-47 could soak up punishment severe enough to destroy 3 other fighters and still manage to limp home. Then, in January 1944, the Americans introduced a new variant in England that cemented the Thunderbolt's shift from object of ridicule to instrument of dread. The P-47D-22 carried a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller with paddle blades over 13 feet in diameter, their broad cords carving into the air like colossal oars. The effect on its climb rate was both immediate and profound, erasing one of the aircraft's most notorious weaknesses. Earlier versions of the Thunderbolt had struggled to climb, managing a sluggish 2,200 feet per minute at sea level. But with the new paddle blade propellers, the rate jumped to 3,000 feet per minute, putting the P-47 on equal footing, or better, with its German opponents at nearly any altitude. The larger propellers also boosted acceleration, letting the Thunderbolt build speed and energy far more quickly in level flight. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran of more than 200 combat sorties, recorded his shock after encountering the upgraded fighters during a bomber interception near Hanover in February 1944. In his combat diary, he wrote, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover, confident of our usual advantage, but they turned into us and came up with us. When we tried to break away, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was hit and exploded. Nothing remained but smoke and fragments." These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. The new propellers didn't just sharpen performance, they altered the very voice of the Thunderbolt. The new propellers gave the Thunderbolt not only power, but a terrifying voice. As the massive blades bit into the air, their tips often broke the sound barrier, producing a thunderous roar that carried for miles. German troops on the ground soon learned to recognize the sound instantly. A a deep, menacing rumble that heralded death from above. They named it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. By March 1944, with the addition of external fuel tanks, the P-47's reach extended deep into the heart of Germany. Standard loadouts included either two 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, pushing its range past 1,000 miles. Crucially, the paddle blade propeller gave the aircraft enough extra performance to fight effectively even after hauling those tanks. The Luftwaffe, unable to best the Thunderbolt in direct contest, shifted strategy, throwing their weight at the bomber formations in hopes that sheer attrition might derail the American daylight offensive. But reaching the bombers now meant breaking through the P-47 escort screen, an undertaking that was fast becoming little more than a death sentence. Even the most hardened Luftwaffe pilots began to speak of the Thunderbolt with reluctant respect, shading into outright fear. Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 victories, most won on the Eastern Front, barely survived an encounter with the big American fighters on March 6, 1944, an engagement that left him gravely wounded. In a post-war interview, he remembered the moment vividly. "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone joked, 'Here come the flying pigs.' But within half a minute, no one was laughing. They fell upon us like an avalanche, so fast we had no time to react. On their first pass, 3 of our fighters vanished, just gone, nothing but burning wreckage. Their guns didn't fire in short bursts like ours," Rao remembered. "They unleashed continuous streams of fire. To be caught in that torrent was instant death." The escort operations also revealed another critical Thunderbolt strength: endurance. Where German fighters had to run at maximum power settings that drained their fuel tanks quickly, the P-47's massive radial engine could cruise efficiently at high altitude, conserving fuel while still carrying the punch to fight when needed. This allowed Thunderbolts to linger with the bomber formations for hours at a time, cycling through top cover positions while still keeping enough reserve for combat and the flight home. By the spring of 1944, as the sleeker, longer-legged P-51 Mustang began assuming the burden of deep escort into Germany, the Thunderbolt found its defining role elsewhere. Its squadrons increasingly turned to ground attack, a mission that would soon make the P-47 the single most feared aircraft faced by German forces. The Thunderbolt's new role took shape in April 1944, as Allied forces readied for the coming invasion of France. Its fearsome battery of 50-caliber machine guns proved just as lethal against ground targets as in the air. Standard armor-piercing incendiary rounds could punch through the thinner top armor of most German vehicles, while the sheer density of fire could reduce soft-skinned targets to wreckage in seconds. A 2-second burst meant 160 half-inch rounds slammed into an area no larger than a truck, enough to obliterate anything caught inside. Yet it was the addition of bombs and rockets that elevated the P-47 into a true multi-role powerhouse. The D-25 variant could haul 2 1,000-pound bombs beneath its wings and a 500-pounder beneath its belly, a bomb load rivaling that of medium bombers from the early war years. Later, Thunderbolt variants introduced zero-length rocket launchers, enabling them to carry 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each one packing the punch of a 105mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, recalled the terror of enduring such attacks. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound alone was enough to unnerve men. Engines howling, rockets shrieking, and then the hammering of those heavy machine guns. An entire column of our trucks simply vanished. 20 vehicles reduced to blazing wreckage in a single pass. The psychological toll was immense. German soldiers called them Jabos, fighter bombers, but to those on the ground they were something even worse: flying artillery, delivering destruction with the precision of sharpshooters. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was confronted with the full scale of its defeat in the skies. More than 500 P-47s blanketed the invasion area, forming a shield of steel and fire that the Germans could not pierce. Those few fighters that tried to break through to the beaches were cut down in droves. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II one of only 3 German pilots to reach the landing zone that morning, later admitted, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were layered from sea level all the way up to 30,000 feet." His own account was stark. "We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters went in. I was the only one who came back. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb above them. You couldn't dive beneath them. Their guns shredded our aircraft into falling sheets of aluminum." In the days after D-Day, the Thunderbolts turned their fury on German ground movement, erasing columns in broad daylight. The scale of destruction was beyond anything the Wehrmacht had endured before. In that single month of June, Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force reported staggering results. 651 locomotives destroyed, along with 3,047 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 553 horse-drawn transports. The devastation forced the Wehrmacht to move under cover of darkness, crippling their ability to react swiftly to Allied offensives. Desperate to blunt the Thunderbolts' dominance, the Germans tried everything, reinforcing armor on their vehicles, deploying heavier concentrations of flak guns, experimenting with improved camouflage. None of it made a difference. The P-47's mix of speed, protection, and overwhelming firepower rendered it all but unstoppable. Even the dreaded 88mm flak guns, so lethal against bombers, struggled to keep pace with the Thunderbolt screaming low across the battlefield. Even as the Thunderbolt was tearing apart German forces in Europe, it was simultaneously proving its mettle in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, operating out of New Guinea, found that the P-47's traits, endurance, toughness, and sheer striking power, were ideally suited to the immense distances and punishing climate of the Pacific theater. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the group, pioneered tactics tailored for this environment. On October 11, 1943, he led just 4 P-47s into battle against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, personally downing 6 enemy planes in a single mission, an achievement that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, long used to dueling against agile but fragile American fighters, were stunned by the Thunderbolt's ability to take hits and keep fighting. Ace Saburo Sakai, who crossed paths with the P-47 over New Guinea, later admitted bluntly, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could bring down a P-40 with just a few hits, seemed useless against the Thunderbolt," Saburo Sakai recalled. "I poured dozens of rounds into one and watched it keep flying. Their return fire was terrifying, solid streams of heavy bullets that ripped our planes to pieces." To meet the demands of the Pacific, engineers developed the P-47N, a variant with expanded fuel capacity. Its redesigned wet wings carried 93 gallons each, giving it an operational range of 2,350 miles. This extended endurance allowed the Thunderbolt to escort B-29s on missions deep into Japan, transforming the once short-legged fighter of 1943 into a true long-range weapon. Perhaps the final proof of the P-47's transformation came in its clashes with Germany's jet-powered fighters. The Messerschmitt Me 262, capable of 540 miles per hour, should have been far beyond the reach of any propeller-driven plane. Yet, Thunderbolt pilots discovered there were 2 key moments when even jets could be caught. Jets were most vulnerable during takeoff and landing, or when a Thunderbolt came screaming down from altitude in a high-speed dive. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group proved this point in dramatic fashion, becoming one of the first pilots to bring down a Messerschmitt Me 262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt built up nearly 500 miles per hour, enough to close the gap on the jet in level flight. The Me 262 pilot, trusting in his unmatched speed, never realized the danger until Meyer's guns opened up from 400 yards. In his combat report, Meyer recorded, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The devastating convergence of 850 caliber machine guns proved far more lethal against jet aircraft than anyone had expected." By early 1945, the Thunderbolt had evolved into its most specialized form with the P-47M, designed expressly to counter Germany's jets and V-1 flying bombs. Equipped with water methanol injection that pushed its double Wasp engine to 2,800 horsepower and refined for better aerodynamics, this ultimate version could achieve 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to challenge even the Me-262 under the right circumstances. In March 1945, Major George Bostwick, leading the 63rd Fighter Squadron, downed 2 of the German jets while flying a P-47M. His after-action report underscored what made the Thunderbolt lethal. The jets are quicker, yes, but they can't turn and they can't take damage. One solid burst from our guns and they come apart like paper. To attack bombers, they have to throttle back, and that's when we pounce. The clearest display of America's industrial dominance came on January 1st, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last great gamble to cripple Allied air power. Nearly 900 German fighters, flown by many of their most seasoned pilots, launched a massive surprise assault on airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, base of the 365th Fighter Group, the strike initially hit hard. German attackers destroyed 22 P-47s on the ground, along with several other aircraft. In the aftermath, a captured Luftwaffe pilot was brought before the American command post. Gesturing toward the burning wrecks, he sneered, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' reply would pass into legend throughout the 9th Air Force. Brookings gestured toward the flight line, where crews were already dragging wrecks aside and laying out pads for replacements. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones," he said coldly. "How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German prisoner's grin vanished. Within 2 days, fresh P-47D-40s from depots in England were lined up where the destroyed aircraft had been. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had lost 271 fighters and 213 pilots during Operation Bodenplatte. Among them, precious instructors and unit commanders they could never replace. American losses across all targeted airfields totaled 134 planes, every one of which was replaced within a week. The figures left no doubt. The outcome was inevitable. Republic Aviation ultimately built 15,883 Thunderbolts during the war, making it the most produced American fighter of the conflict. At the height of production, the Republic factory at Farmingdale, Long Island, was rolling out a completed Thunderbolt every single hour, day and night. In Evansville, Indiana, a vast new plant built on farmland in 1942 was by 1944 turning out 500 aircraft each month. Constructing a single P-47D demanded 65,000 separate parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, over 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine alone contained 2,400 precision machine components, each crafted to tolerances within 1,000th of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never laid hands on an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these machines with a consistency and accuracy that often surpassed peacetime standards. The scale of support needed was just as immense. Each Thunderbolt sortie consumed 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and with hundreds of missions flown daily, the U.S. industrial base had to feed an insatiable demand for firepower. By mid-1944, the Thunderbolt's appetite for ammunition had climbed beyond 10 million rounds each month. At the Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, just one of several plants, production reached 30 million rounds monthly. Every cartridge was crafted to exacting tolerances, measured in 10,000ths of an inch to ensure flawless feeding through the Thunderbolt's synchronized gun systems. Fuel demands were just as staggering. A single P-47 consumed around 100 gallons of fuel per hour in routine flight, and as much as 300 gallons in combat when water injection was engaged. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was burning through more than 25 million gallons of aviation fuel every month, all of it ferried across the Atlantic in tankers, themselves born of America's assembly lines. Yet perhaps even more remarkable than the output of machines and fuel was the output of men. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots each year from advanced training schools, more than Germany managed to train during the entire course of the war. Every Thunderbolt pilot logged at least 400 hours of flight time before seeing combat, with a full quarter of that spent in advanced fighter trainers. By the war's end, many German replacements were climbing into cockpits with less than 100 total hours. The disparity showed clearly in battle. American aviators entered the skies of Europe already well versed in formation, flying, instrument navigation, aerial gunnery, and tactical doctrine. They had even trained against captured German aircraft, learning firsthand the strengths and weaknesses of their opponents. Their familiarity with their own machines was equally deep. U.S. pilots studied detailed technical manuals that their German counterparts never received. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who arrived in England in September 1944, was a clear product of this system, an example of how preparation translated directly into survival and success. I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 in the P-47, Lieutenant Roberts recalled. I'd fired at towed sleeves, drilled in deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from real engagements. So, when my first mission came, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I met that day couldn't have had half my training. It wasn't even a fair contest. By March 1945, even those who had once ridiculed the Thunderbolt were forced to admit the truth. Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, the same man who had sneered at the P-47 as a pregnant cow 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials hoping for a morale-boosting statement. What he told them was so bleak it was never printed. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is without precedent. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, and never seem to run dry in the middle of a fight. A Thunderbolt can haul bombs like a medium bomber, fire rockets like a piece of mobile artillery, and still fight like a true interceptor when pressed, Priller admitted. But beyond the aircraft itself lies what it symbolizes: limitless American production. They lose 10, and by tomorrow they have 20 more. We lose one, and it is gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than the men we use as instructors. They have fuel for endless practice, ammunition to spare, replacement parts for every system. We have nothing left but courage. And courage, without the resources to support it, is only a slower kind of defeat. In 1943, we laughed at them. Now, no one is laughing. When you hear those guns open up, you understand. Death is on its way. That sound stays with you long after the fight. Mechanical, precise, relentless. Everything about the Thunderbolt reflected America's overwhelming industrial power, Priller concluded. They didn't defeat us with clever tactics or braver men. They smothered us beneath an avalanche of steel and lead. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was little more than a name. Fuel shortages kept most planes on the ground. Veteran pilots were dead or prisoners, and airfields lay shattered under endless bombardment. Yet, even if the aircraft and fuel had been there, the math was hopeless. Any German sortie meant flying straight into the wall of P-47 formations that dominated every layer of the sky, from treetop level to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last pilots trained in 1945, flew just a single combat mission before the war ended. His duel with Thunderbolts over Leipzig was brutally short. It lasted 12 seconds. I saw them drop out of the sky, 4 Thunderbolts, perfectly aligned, Brettschneider later recounted. I tried to break away, but they were too fast. The leader opened fire from 500 meters, and my plane felt as if giant hammers were smashing it apart. The engine exploded, a wing tore off, and I barely escaped. Hanging in my parachute, I watched them wipe out my entire staffel, 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky itself seemed to rain burning aluminum and bodies. By then, the psychological toll was absolute. Luftwaffe doctors even coined a term, Jabo fever, or fighter-bomber fever, to describe the trembling, nausea, and other stress symptoms pilots experienced when Thunderbolts were reported nearby. Men who had flown calmly against Spitfires and Hurricanes found themselves physically ill before missions involving P-47s. The deep rolling thunder of an approaching Thunderbolt became enough to spread panic among German troops, who knew that survival depended on diving for cover without hesitation. The final tally of the P-47's war record is almost beyond belief. In Europe alone, Thunderbolts accounted for 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat and another 3,315 wiped out on the ground. They obliterated 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and 60,000 horse-drawn wagons. In the Pacific, their impact was no less devastating. 697 Japanese aircraft shot down in combat, 150 destroyed on the ground, along with 1,500 vehicles, 150 locomotives, and an untold number of barges, ships, and coastal installations reduced to ruins. The 9th Air Force alone, its squadrons built largely around the Thunderbolt, logged 213,173 combat sorties. In those missions, they dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and loosed 60,000 rockets. P-47 units achieved a remarkable 4.6-to-1 kill ratio in the air while suffering the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber force. Yet behind the statistics lay a grim human toll. The Luftwaffe lost an estimated 28,000 fighter pilots in combat against the Western Allies, many of them victims of the withering streams of American .50 caliber fire. Each loss represented years of training, experience, and skill that Germany could no longer afford to replace. By the war's final months, the average German fighter pilot entered battle with fewer than 30 hours of combat experience, no match for the seasoned, heavily armed Thunderbolt formations that dominated the skies. The average Thunderbolt pilot, by contrast, entered combat with more than 200 hours in the cockpit. At the Luftwaffe's interrogation center in Oberursel, captured Allied aviators were questioned in detail, and their reports were compiled into intelligence files. Documents recovered in 1945 reveal how German assessments of the P-47 evolved as the war dragged on. In April 1943, the entry was dismissive: large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all areas of performance except dive speed, machine gun armament inadequate against cannon-armed fighters. Overall assessment: minimal threat. By December 1943, however, the tone had shifted noticeably. Outstanding high-altitude performance, extremely strong airframe, armament increasingly troublesome, enemy pilots adopting improved tactics. Overall assessment: growing concern. By mid-1944, German intelligence no longer underestimated the Thunderbolt. The June entry read, "Dominant fighter bomber. Superior to all German aircraft above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against every target. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Overall assessment: critical threat at all altitudes." By March 1945, the judgment was final. Best fighter bomber of the war. Its blend of firepower, resilience, and performance is unmatched. Pilot quality is exceptional. Direct engagement is unsustainable. Decades later, in 1985, former foes gathered in Phoenix, Arizona, for a reunion of German and American fighter pilots. There, General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who had once commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was asked directly for his thoughts on the P-47. His answer, captured on video, revealed just how completely German perceptions had shifted. "In 1943, we made a grave mistake," Galland admitted. "We looked at this huge, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we told ourselves. They've built a bomber and called it a fighter. But we were the ones who failed to understand. The Americans weren't trying to build a European fighter. They built an American fighter, one shaped by their priorities of mass production, overwhelming firepower, and sheer survivability. They knew that in a war of attrition, the machine that could absorb punishment and still deliver destruction would prevail. And they were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, everything became clear to me. The power was astonishing. It climbed as if it were falling upward. And the cockpit. It was spacious, comfortable, built for long missions. The visibility was excellent, the controls precise. It was, in every sense, a pilot's airplane. Only this one was wrapped in armor," Galland continued. "But what struck me most was not just the aircraft itself, but the scale of what it represented. America built more than 15,000 of these complex machines while waging a war on 2 oceans. Each Thunderbolt required an engine far more sophisticated than anything we produced in Germany, yet they turned them out faster than we could manufacture our simplest fighters. That was the moment I realized we never truly had a chance. We called the roar of its guns Roosevelt's piano because of the deep, relentless rhythm they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. For many of my comrades, it was the last thing they ever heard. The P-47 did not merely defeat the Luftwaffe, it dismantled it. Its very design embodied American industrial philosophy, brute force engineering powered by resources without limit. Every element of the aircraft was constructed with a level of redundancy and strength that bordered on excessive. Its wing spars were so robust they could bear 40,000 pounds, triple the actual loaded weight. The engine mount had been designed to survive stresses up to 12 times the force of gravity, while the control cables ran in duplicate across the frame, backed by automatic fail-safes to ensure constant responsiveness. Even the ammunition delivery system was a feat in itself. 8 separate boxes, each stocked with 425 rounds, all driven by electric boost motors that kept the belts moving smoothly during high-stress maneuvers, where jams could be fatal. To guard against freezing in the thin, frigid air at altitude, the guns were fitted with electric heaters. Each weapon carried its own independent charging unit, and every one of them could be synchronized individually, allowing the pilot to rely on precision fire no matter the conditions. The gun convergence could be finely tuned anywhere between 150 and 400 yards, giving each pilot the flexibility to set his weapons for the range he felt most comfortable fighting at. After the conflict, some German veterans tried to dismiss the P-47's success as nothing more than a matter of overwhelming numbers, claiming that their own fighters had been technically superior, but simply outmatched by sheer mass. Yet the combat records contradict that narrative. Whenever the odds were even, Thunderbolts repeatedly came out on top. Their battery of heavy machine guns, often derided as weaker than cannon, proved far more practical in the chaos of aerial combat. Gun camera analyses showed the reason. Cannon shells did tremendous damage when they hit, but they demanded pinpoint accuracy and carried only a small supply, usually no more than 120 to 200 rounds. The P-47's machine guns, by contrast, delivered sustained, decisive firepower that pilots could count on to turn an engagement in their favor. The P-47's guns didn't just fire, it saturated the air ahead with a storm of lead, creating a lethal spread that meant even less than perfect aim still delivered results. At the distances where most dogfights unfolded, a 2-second burst could drive 20 or more rounds straight into a fighter-sized target. More than enough to rip it apart. The ammunition itself gave the Thunderbolt a further edge. American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds carried a delayed fuse, allowing them to punch through a target before igniting. Once they burned, the incendiary compound reached 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to set aluminum frames ablaze. German 20mm shells hit harder in a single strike, but their tendency to explode on contact often resulted in dramatic flashes that failed to cripple an opponent. In the end, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt stood as the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever built in large numbers, a machine that combined raw mass with unmatched staying power. The Thunderbolt was a monster in every sense. Stripped of fuel and ammunition, it still weighed 10,000 pounds, heavier than the fully loaded weight of certain twin-engine fighters. Its massive power plant generated more thrust than entire bomber squadrons of the First World War, and its 8 heavy guns could unleash more firepower than an infantry platoon on the ground. Yet thousands were built, handed over to young pilots barely past high school, and kept combat-ready by mechanics who had only weeks of training before being shipped to the front. Within less than 2 years, German pilots who once ridiculed it as a clumsy, flying milk bottle learned to fear it above all others. Men who had flown unshaken against Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks would later describe encounters with the P-47 in quiet, almost reverent tones, even decades after the war had ended. Today, a restored P-47D stands proudly at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, sharing the floor with the most iconic fighters in history. At the museum, the P-47's information placard lists performance figures and combat achievements, yet the truest account comes from a modest glass case beside it. Inside lie a handful of spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film capturing the moment a Focke-Wulf 190 was torn apart in midair. Beneath the display, a quotation from a captured German pilot in 1945 lays bare the shift in perception. "We laughed when we first saw them, those fat, clumsy American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. The laughter ended when we understood they didn't have to. All they had to do was aim those guns, and you vanished." Our laughter died with our comrades. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war as a subject of mockery, but closed it as a weapon of destruction without equal. Across those years, its 8 Browning machine guns changed the face of air combat, overwhelming the Luftwaffe with relentless firepower. In April 1943, German pilots sneered at the ungainly newcomer. By May 1945, there were no voices left to mock it. The roar of the Thunderbolt had silenced them all, and the skies had become the domain of America.